Yes, thank you for the introduction. It's so nice to be here. Really excited to be giving this talk. I'm going to talk about what I worked on during my PhD for the last 5 years now, which is mostly sentence production and comprehension and their neural correlates. So let's say the starting idea is that I want to understand whether production and comprehension are two sides of the same coin or just two different coins, basically. And if we think about the different representations that are necessary for both production and comprehension, like semantic structure, syntactic structure, ethnological structure, we know that they're important for both, but probably the context and the order, the way in which they are built can be slightly different between production and comprehension. And so that's what I want to try to get at in this talk, try to understand a bit more how similarly and differently they are encoded in the brain. So just to give an example for a psycholinguistic model that thinks about production and comprehension, I would say traditionally they've been discussed kind of separately, with some exceptions, of course. And this is a model by Pickering and Garrett that tried to unify them and try to think about how production and comprehension can be intertwined. But in doing so, they still kept them quite separately. So when we try to speak, so when we try to produce, there's a production implementer, and then the monitoring is done by a comprehension implementer. So the production and comprehension aspects, even during speaking, are still thought of as separate. And that also suggests that then the neural systems that do production and comprehension might be separate. And I want to try to kind of think about this, because that would also mean that it's not a very parsimonious model if we need to do separate things for encoding the same linguistic structure. And so if we take kind of this simplified representation of what happens during speaking and listening, I guess we can all agree that production and comprehension do differ at some point. So for articulation, obviously, we need the motor system, and for perception, we need the auditory cortex. But we also know that at some point, at some level, there's going to be some unification of the two systems, because now that I'm talking and you're understanding what I'm saying, I mean, more or less we get to the same idea. And it's just what happens in between that is a bit more unclear, whether it's done in two different ways, it's represented in different ways in the brain. So to what extent are syntactic encoding and parsing and syntactic structure encoded separately? And so I tried to address this question looking at the neural correlates for production and comprehension. And when I started my PhD, just two studies came out for time apart, two meta-analyses of the neural correlates for production and comprehension that were heavily biased towards comprehension. So this is the number of studies that were taken into account with speaking and listening, and now you just see the proportion, but it's in the Index study, for example, over 100 studies of comprehension and just 14 studies of production. And so there's really an imbalance in the field. Of course, here I'm talking about studies with healthy participants, because it's a bit different with the vision things. So there are fewer studies of production and comprehension, and that's due to two main reasons. One is that there are motion artifacts with production that I think they're a bit harder to deal with. I think some people don't really want to have that problem, and it's way easier to study comprehension. So that's one of the reasons why it's generally thought that you cannot study speaking with fMRI, or even EEG, MEG, even worse. And the other reason is that experimental control is way harder with production than comprehension. So in comprehension studies, you can just show some sentences, present some sentences auditorily or reading. You have all the control you want over what people are going to hear. But in production, it's way harder to have people say what you want them to say without telling them what to say. How do you do it? And it's never going to be really spontaneous. So I think these are the reasons why there's way fewer studies, but that also gives a bit of an unfair picture of the differences between production and comprehension and what we know about them. So basically, there's, I think, two problems then with these meta-analyses. One is that they found inconsistent results. So the Walensky meta-analysis found middle frontal gyrus and posterior temporal regions that were reliably engaged for sentence production relative to baseline, while the Indefy study only found GA44 as the reliable region for, in this case, syntactic, mostly comparisons. And this is quite different from the comprehension studies that instead, I mean, we see in Walensky the typical language network regions were found for sentence comprehension, and similarly, the interface study found a lot more frontal and temporal regions. So we see differences between the production studies and with the comprehension networks, which is a bit problematic given what I just said before, that there are the linguistic items that we use in production comprehension are actually the same. So there should be some level of similarity. So what I tried to do then, this was to run a study that was a bit more powered than the previous studies, to try and understand really if we can see the same regions in production and comprehension. And I did this by doing a production version of a study that was run 10 years ago by Christophe Pallier and colleagues in Paris, where they looked at constituent size and how the brain responded to word sequences that were organized in sentences of organized in different constituents. So for example, the word sequences were 12 words, and the words could either be all processed separately, so like just word sequences that don't have anything to do with each other, or organized in constituents of increasing length. So for example, 2 words together like they are, or 12 words that all together form a sentence. And they saw the brain activity increased in these regions as a function of constituent size. So what I tried to do here was to do kind of the same thing, but in production, even though, of course, like I said, it's a lot harder to have this with production. So we only had 3 levels of constituent size. And this is basically what participants had to do. They saw screens like this with 2 items that they had to name and 2 verbs. The experiment was done in Dutch because I live in the Netherlands. So most people speak Dutch there. And basically they had to form sentences just from the screen. And the white boxes indicate how the words should be combined. So in pointer, so in this case, the items would be produced separately. So participants would say to clap, to sleep, the man, the woman. While here, they would put them together. So the woman sleeps, the man talks. And here, it would be all together. So one single sentence to say, for example, the man hears that the woman claps. And I should just say that in Dutch, the that is compulsory, while in English, you can also say the man hears the woman claps, or like this. In Dutch, you have to say it. So this is the only difference between the sentences. Otherwise, the same words were said throughout the conditions, just organized in different structures. Just to show this, basically, yeah, you're saying the same things, but the underlying structure differs a bit between these conditions. And that's what we try to look at. We had 40 participants, and participants either produced or listened to these sentences in different blocks. Okay, so I'm gonna jump right into the results. First, we looked at the production and comprehension networks and where they differ, which is what I mentioned at the start. I mean, there must be a level where production and comprehension then diverge, and that's exactly what we saw here. So in orange, you see regions that responded more in production than comprehension, and that's, you see, a bilateral network, mostly centered around motor cortex and supplementary motor area. Instead, the comprehension network is in blue, is mostly auditory cortex, and I think also some default model network, which probably relates to the fact that comprehension, there was a bit less to do relative to production. So I think this all makes sense. This is also a nice sanity check for the study. And then we looked into constituent size. So you see here in orange, regions that responded to constituent size throughout the experiment. And in blue are the regions that reliably responded to constituent size in both production and comprehension. And so this really reminds us of the network that I showed at the start, found by Walensky et al., where there's this large frontotemporal network that seems to be engaged for both production and comprehension. And this is in response to syntactic processing, kind of broadly defined this constituent size manipulation. We also looked if there were some regions that responded differently to constituent size in production and comprehension. And so you see here in orange, the regions that were more responsive to constituent size during production relative to comprehension. And so that's here frontal gyrus and posterior temporal lobe mostly. So that shows that there's also a bit of an imbalance or a different loading in the network, and some regions in this experiment responded more to constituent size in production, or were more active for syntactic processing in production than comprehension, which could also be related to the fact that production here was really a task and comprehension was a bit easier in the context of this experiment. And I'm going to come back to this and later on. We also ran an ROI analysis with ROIs defined based on neurosynth for a general effect of syntax. And we see kind of the same pattern with some different loading in the network for production comprehension, but we also see this reliable gradient in response to constituent size. So both the IFG and the MTG respond to constituent size in production comprehension, but the IFG responds a bit more to constituent size in production and comprehension. And there's also a bit of a different loading with the MTG being more active in comprehension than production and the IFG more active in production and comprehension. I think there's multiple ways that we can interpret this. So going back to the first question that I tried to address here, we found that there's a large shared frontotemporal network for production and comprehension. So this is reassuring. And it probably means that the meta-analysis that I mentioned before were just underpowered because there were so few studies of production that it wasn't really a fair comparison to comprehension. And also some of these studies were run maybe 20 years ago where it was more standard to have fewer participants. But we also saw that there are some differences in the production and comprehension networks. So production responds to constituent size more. And that could also signal that production is harder. In production, we have to encode what we want to say. It's not really acceptable to say things that don't make sense or words that don't go together, at least in most cases. And instead, in comprehension, we can also sometimes be a bit more lazy. So I think this could differ a bit based on the different contexts where production and comprehension are happening. The next thing that we try to do now that we see that there's a shared network, we try to look at how the connectivity between these frontotemporal regions was affected by modality. So we see that IFG and MTG are both present. Are they maybe connected in a different way in production and comprehension? So maybe connectivity is stronger within the IFG for production because then there is articulation needed, or maybe the temporal lobe has stronger connectivity during comprehension because that's where the auditory input comes in, and so on. So these are possible hypotheses. And so we ran this analysis on the same study that I just mentioned, and we used two regions that were seed regions from where we modeled the connectivity. These were the pars triangularis of the IFG, so BA45 here in yellow, and the posterior temporal lobe. So this region here in yellow again. And we looked at how these two regions were connected to the other regions in this network, so BA44 and the anterior temporal lobe, which means that we looked at connectivity from BA45 to the rest of the regions and from posterior temporal lobe to inferior frontal gyrus and anterior temporal lobe. And I should say that now I'm going to say quite often from this region to this region, but actually this is not a directed measure of connectivity. So the connectivity could be going either way. We don't know. Okay, we selected voxels that responded to constituent size in the original study just to constrain a bit the search space because these are large masses. Okay, so again, jumping right into the results. So here we see connectivity from BA45 to ATL, BA44, and posterior temporal lobe. I hope it's okay that I keep switching between IFG pars superficialis and IFG pars triangularis and BA44 and 45. BA44 and 45 are just way easier to say, so I stick with that. So the first thing that we saw is that there was an effect of ROI. So connectivity was much stronger between the IFG and the posterior temporal lobe than with the anterior temporal lobe. But the effect of constituent size was present in all of the ROIs. So the connectivity increased as a function of constituent size. There was stronger connectivity in this network for the longer sentences than for the word sequences. And we also saw a marginal effect for an interaction between modality and constituent size in the connectivity between the two IFG regions here. And for the connectivity from the posterior temporal lobe to the rest of the regions, we see the same effect with stronger connectivity between the posterior temporal lobe and the inferior frontal gyrus than between the posterior temporal lobe and the anterior temporal lobe. So I think that's quite interesting because these two regions, the posterior and anterior temporal lobe, are adjacent, but somehow the posterior temporal lobe and the IFG seem to be more strongly connected than the two adjacent regions, posterior and anterior temporal lobe. But again, connectivity is still increasing for constituent size in all of these regions. So we still see in the anterior temporal lobe that there's increased connectivity as a function of constituent size. And here we also saw that there's actually a quadratic effect as well. So the effect was both linear and quadratic when we checked for that. So I think there was a bit of variability in the network, and there weren't really significant differences between regions in the way that the connectivity went. But it seems the connectivity was mostly increased as a function of sentences. So C2 and C4 had sentences, and C1 was just word sequences. And it seems that it was going a bit in this direction, that connectivity between regions increased when you were trying to maybe combine words together. And here we also found an effect of modality, where connectivity increased between the posterior temporal lobe and the inferior frontal gyrus in production relative to comprehension. So suggesting here that, again, maybe this is related to the articulatory aspects of production or the phonological encoding in production that needs to take place for speaking to actually happen. And we know that this is carried out by frontal cortex together with premotor and motor cortex. So this could be an effect of this particular aspect of production, this modality effect, because it wasn't seen to interact with constituent size. So it wasn't seen to be an effect related to the syntactic processing step. Okay, so if we try to summarize the results, we saw increased connectivity as a function of constituent size consistently throughout the network. We saw that there's stronger connectivity between the posterior temporal lobe and the IFG relative to the inferior temporal lobe. And there's stronger connectivity in production than comprehension, but not as a function of constituent size. So this seems to be a production-specific effect. And we also didn't see modality effects in the way connectivity in the way the regions connected to each other in response to constituent size. So the modality effects seem to be purely production comprehension differences and not syntactic differences. So we see that modality doesn't really affect the connectivity between IFG and MTG when we focus on syntactic processing. So it does seem to affect the network in these more peripheral ways. But connectivity increases as a function of constituent size throughout the network for both production and comprehension. So I think what I've talked about so far in general shows that syntactic operations engage the same network in production and comprehension. And so there's that's a good starting point to argue that it's possible that the same neural systems are doing production and comprehension, and it's not necessary to think about dissociations between production and comprehension in this network based on these results. But the next thing that we can do is then think about the dynamics of the network and think about how these regions connect and how the different processes affect the network, let's say. So going back to this kind of simplified overview of what happens with production and comprehension, the contexts are very different between production and comprehension. So in production, we start from a situation model. We need to encode several structures to be able to speak, while in comprehension, we start from these sound sequences, and that's going to affect a bit what is available for us to build a syntactic structure, a semantic structure, and so on. And so it's possible that actually there's going to be some differences in the latency of the both response and of activation of different regions as a function of these differences. And so the first thing that we tried to do was to look at the latency of the bold response in production comprehension, which again was inspired by this previous study of consequence size done in comprehension over 10 years ago by Christopher, where they saw that the bold response peaked later as a function of consequence size. So that's what you see here. So with the larger consequence, there was a later bold response, a later peak of the bold response, suggesting that it takes longer to fully put together all the words of the sentence. And so we checked whether this was also the case in comprehension in our study. And we also looked at whether in production that went a different way. And that's exactly what we found. So we saw a later bold peak as a function of constituent size in comprehension. So that's here in the green. And in production, instead, we saw the opposite response. So there was an earlier peak for the more complex structures in production relative to a later peak for the easier structures. And we think this also relates to the onset times and to the planning that needs to take place in production. So the more complex structures meant the participants to be able to start speaking had to have a better encoding of what was coming up to avoid too many disfluencies, for example, throughout the sentence. And that also relates to these longer onset times for the more complex conditions. While the word sequences, you could start encoding the first word and then go on and encode everything as it went. And there were also pauses between each word. And so this seems to suggest that then we do see exactly what we were expecting, that in production, when you have to plan more and think more, actually, that's the brain responds a bit earlier than when you can incrementally articulate or incrementally encode everything that you're going to say. So yeah, we see that the temporal dynamics of this network are affected by modality with this like kind of coarse analysis in the original study that I talked about. But then we were also curious about spontaneous production. And so I think this is important for two main reasons. So first, going back to what I said at the start, it's much harder to have experimental control in production than comprehension. And so that comes at some costs. So here, participants had to talk given this screen where they had to just form these sentences that I told them they had to say, and it wasn't what they wanted to say. They couldn't say it how they wanted to say. They had to follow very clear rules. And that's obviously not how we speak. And that's not a problem necessarily of just this study. It's something that happens in a lot of production studies, just a feature of production studies. Of course, there are also exceptions and there are some more spontaneous studies. But then what we wanted to ask first was, okay, do we actually see that the same brain regions more or less respond to production when it is elicited spontaneously, how we normally speak? And then do we actually see similar temporal dynamics? Because also when we speak spontaneously, maybe we can, we don't have to encode so much. We can speak more incrementally, maybe that changes, and so on. So what we did was take an open data set that was shared online. So this started during COVID times. So it was also, I guess we all experienced these times where I was very lucky to find this data set, and the researchers that shared it also provided me with word timestamps so that I could link every word with the neural data. And so basically what happened here, participants watched an episode of a TV series, the BBC Sherlock TV series. It's very funny in case you haven't seen it. And 16 participants then were asked to recall the events of this TV series. So they were still in the scanner and they had to talk spontaneously about what happened. And I think they did a really good job. They talked for 10 to 15 minutes. And so we have different recalls for each of these participants, which is also quite unique because in many of the comprehension studies, actually, we have one text, one audiobook that is presented to everyone. So this is one major difference between production and comprehension naturalistic studies. And then the recall of one participant was presented to 36 comprehension participants that was shared as part of another set. And I'm going to show you how this sounds.
Okay, so they began with like a dream sequence of a shootout. It's during the day.
Okay, so as you hear, this is very spontaneous. It's just a person talking about what happened. There's notes in there as well. There are pauses between words. And this goes on for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, different lengths in each participant. And obviously each participant encodes this as they want or talks about it as they want. So it wasn't really obvious here. We couldn't really do like a comparison like we did before between conditions, as is normally done in academic studies. So we took an approach that is becoming more common with the naturalistic comprehension studies that was inspired by John Brennan and Giglio, where basically for all the sentences that participants produced, we extracted the syntactic structure using the Stanford parser. So we got a syntactic tree like this. And I should say we had to do this automatically because otherwise it would have been way too much work to do it manually and to check everything. But then we did a check of a sample of sentences and we correlated the measures that we were interested in between the reviewed sentences and the automatically labeled sentences, and the correlation was very high. So the Stanford parser could do this relatively well. And then from the syntactic structure, we extracted some complexity metrics that were word by word metrics using different strategies to build the syntactic structure. So again, this is inspired by work by Brennan and Gill. And the two main strategies that we focused on were a top-down strategy, where you build the structure from the top of the tree to the bottom of the tree, based on the nodes you encounter. So from the S node, as you go down to the word, you can build 3 nodes and so on for every word. And this is compared to a bottom-up parsing models that instead builds nodes from the bottom of the tree to the top, but only once you're sure about what node you're seeing. So you can only build the S node at the very end of the sentence, once you've met all of the other nodes that are attached to the sentence node. And so these two strategies make different hypotheses about when the structure is built. And we also expected that this would be a difference between production and comprehension. So just to give a very obvious example, if we're saying the sentence is examining one of the bodies, once we get to bodies, we're kind of done encoding the sentence. It's quite unlikely that we're still building all of these nodes as we go. And if we're doing that, it's also very likely that we made a mistake at some point because we don't really know yet what we built once we're saying this word. So it's more likely that top-down better reproduces what is going on during production. So the way that we linked these word-by-word measures to brain activity was by having these weights for every word that were linked to the onset times of each word, and then convolving the weights with the hemodynamic response function to get estimated time series, predictor time series for each predictor of interest. So this top-down and bottom-up parsing nodes. And then we compare this predictor time series to the actually extracted measured time series from 3 regions of interest, the posterior temporal lobe and the 44 and 45, which are regions that have been hypothesized to be involved in syntactic processing in several studies. Okay. So we looked at top-down and bottom-up on top of a baseline model where we modeled word rate, syllable rate, word frequency, word surprisal, and so on, to make sure that what we were looking at was really just syntactic processing and not to these compounding variables. And what we found was that activity increased in these 3 regions as a function of top-down node count, node building. So when there were more nodes that were being built, which usually happened at the onset, at the start of phrases, then activity increased in production, while in relation to bottom-up, activity decreased. So at the end of phrases and sentences, there was an increase in activity. In production, instead, we saw the opposite pattern. Activity was decreased, especially in posterior temporal lobe, in relation to top-down nodes. So at phrase onset, it was more likely decreased than at phrase offset, and same here for the bottom-up count, we see the opposite, the reverse response, where there's an increase in activity at the end of sentences in comprehension. So we see again these divergent dynamics, this opposite pattern between production and comprehension. And then another analysis that we did that I think is also interesting to show here was to look at sentence onset and sentence offset effects, because they could be correlated with the top-down and bottom-up effects that I just showed, especially the bottom-up models a lot of structure building to happen at the end of sentences, so that could also just be some general sentence wrap-up effect. And so what we saw was that in production, actually, these regions were not really related to sentence onset and offset, which could also be related to the fact that sentences are not so obvious in production, especially once you hear a lot of these recordings, participants just keep talking, and very often once wasn't very clear to know when a sentence ended. So they would go on and talk and for very long, and it was still the same sentence syntactically, and then right after they would start with the same one. So I think there's maybe rather planning stages, but not so much sentences as we usually define them when we read or something. But instead, in comprehension, sentences were really tracked. So they were overlapping, interestingly. And we see the same pattern with activity decreasing at sentence onset, but increasing at the end of sentences, which really suggests that towards the end of sentences, participants were trying to maybe put everything together, combine all of the words, and so on. Okay, so going back to this little overview, we see again that there are divergent dynamics for structure building. And the next thing we wanted to check was whether we could model these dynamics a bit better in sentence production. So this is a bit more specific to sentence production, but where I wanted to see again, okay, do we see these differences in speech fluency patterns that are related to the dynamics of the responses of the different regions? And this was also inspired by the fact that the models that we use are mostly discussed in the context of comprehension. So these top-down and bottom-up models are thought more broadly for comprehension than production. So we made two different versions of these models that would apply a bit better to psycholinguistic theories of sentence production. And so we had a more and a less incremental parser that we could compare to the top-down model. So we had this top-down model that builds nodes word by word, but we also had an early top-down model that builds nodes at one word for the next word, which makes sense when we think that we're saying a word. Normally, the production models assume that we have already done grammatical encoding for that word before we articulate. And so now the nodes were assigned to the previous, the nodes for a word were assigned to the previous word. So at examining, we're building the nodes for one, and at one, the nodes for all, and so on. But other theories of sentence production instead assume that we need to plan a lot more when we speak. So that the verb is the central item of the sentence, and we need to plan the verb first. And so maybe actually we're building all of the nodes for the sentence up until the verb, and then at the verb we can build the nodes for the rest of the sentence, and so on. So we have larger chunks of structure building and a bit less often. So these are the three different models. The model was based on the dependency parser, and I'm not going to go into too much detail now, just to find the different points where we could focalize node building. Okay. So we saw that the top-down parser obviously did quite well. We saw it already before, but the early top-down parser did even better. And it doesn't really look like this here, but actually now there was an interaction between the parser and ROI. So this model had a better model fit. The early top-down parser did way better than the chunked model, as well as you can see. And it also kind of shows that the posterior temporal lobes seem to respond later to nodes, because now that we assigned the nodes earlier, suddenly the posterior temporal lobe wasn't doing very well anymore. So it seems that the posterior temporal lobe responds a bit later to this node building, while BA45 responds possibly even a bit earlier. And we also checked this with an analysis of the temporal derivative of the bold response. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the temporal derivative, but it kind of models how the hemodynamic response function models the data. So it could be earlier or later, it differs a bit between regions as a function of what you're doing. And the temporal derivative results told us that actually the posterior temporal lobe responded later to node counts, while BA45 responded earlier. So we see this dissociation in the responses between regions as well. And we see that structure building now in production was anticipatory, so it happened before word onsets and also very incremental. So not as in large planning stages as suggested by some psycholinguistic models. And this was also linked to the pause length before word onsets. There were longer, so there was a longer pause before a word if that word was associated to increase top-down nodes. So to increase structure building associated with that word. And it was instead a bit shorter or larger bottom-up nodes, which usually happens towards the end of the sentence. So probably the planning for that word had a very good place. Okay, so we see that sentence production is incremental and anticipatory. So again, we see this association between the speech fluency patterns and full response, and we see these divergent dynamics between production and comprehension. And so going back to the original question that I asked at the start, are syntactic parsing and syntactic encoding kind of the same in terms at least of brain regions or general processes? So do these different dynamics mean that there are also different processes for production and comprehension? And I think I cannot really answer this question with the studies that I presented. But what I want to say is maybe just think about this a bit. So syntactic encoding and parsing are kind of building the same structure, so building syntactic structure, both in production and comprehension, but they have different contexts. And so these different contexts could be the reason why we see these differences in timing throughout the network, and don't really have to be, these differences don't really have to be the reason for different processes. But that's, I mean, that's just a hypothesis. It doesn't have to be really like this. I think we don't know this really yet. But one Gerard Hempen suggested that actually lexicosyntactic information, which is what you need for syntactic processing, is extracted in different ways between production and comprehension. So in production, you start from the semantic structure, you have these lexicosyntactic strings that you need to build, while in comprehension, you have chronological information. And so that these two different ways that you get there could also, that's the next step, this could drive these different dynamics. So in production, this can happen earlier, and in comprehension, this happens, the syntactic processing happens a bit later, because of you need to hear more input to be able to really build the structure. And I think also what these different dynamics actually allows for is asking a lot more questions about how the structures are built in production and comprehension, and whether this changes as a function of communicative context. So actually many studies before found top-down models activity in comprehension pretty well. And in this study, instead, we found the top-down was kind of inverse to what was going on in terms of mode response. So it could mean that in this case, participants were hearing this person that just talked about what happened. The people that were talking about the events of the TV series did not really have an audience. We're just speaking in the scanner and did not have any response and feedback from the person they were talking to. So maybe they also didn't try so hard to encode properly what they were saying. They had so many misfluencies. And maybe the participants that were comprehending stopped predicting much about what was going to happen, which is instead what would happen during audible listening, for example. So it could be that actually these dynamics are just a function of like this experiment. And in different cases, you see the dynamics change as a function of what is available for participants. And for example, now participants made a lot of misfluencies in production, so there was a lot more incremental structure building. But in cases where you cannot make so many errors, either because you cannot be understood, or I don't know, when you're giving a talk and you want to try to be clear, then maybe you plan a lot more in advance. And that's going to affect a bit how the different parsers model brain activity. So these are just ideas that make you think about how these parsers could be a nice way to study these processes and to link production and comprehension. And the last thing that I want to mention, so going back to the brain architecture for speaking and listening. So initially, I said that we have this same frontotemporal network that responds to sentence production and comprehension. And we see the stronger response to production, but we don't see this so much with these parser count. So when elicited spontaneously, it doesn't seem like production really has this super large response, while comprehension is much lower. It seems to be quite balanced. We see that connectivity is enhanced as a function of participant size, only partly as a function of modality. But the phrase structure building results actually indicate some differences between production and comprehension. So we see that BA45 responds earlier than the posterior temporal lobe in production. And instead in comprehension, we only see a response of the temporal lobe as a function of structure building. But we do see an effect of BA45 only at sentence offset, so at the end of sentences. And so one way that we can try to integrate these differences is again thinking about this, this model where we get to lexicosyntactic information from different structures that maybe BA45 is kind of involved in some level at the mapping, in the mapping between semantic and syntactic structure. And instead, the posterior temporal lobe would be involved in these different stages. I know this is still quite vague, it's just very speculative. And that's why we see these differences in latencies between production and comprehension. But of course, this will have to be tested and integrated with different models. Okay. So just to summarize what I talked about today, we saw that there's a similar network between production and comprehension that has different loading and different dynamics of activation based on modality. I think we are still missing quite a bit about what is going on in this network. So I only talked about fMRI studies with quite low temporal resolution. That's just how fMRI works. And there's a lot of MEG studies of comprehension that show that there's a lot more interaction between these regions that I can really show with fMRI, where BA45 and the posterior temporal lobe actually connect back and forth a lot in the time that we can measure with fMRI. So actually there's probably a lot more going on that we can sample here, but already it's nice that we can see a few temporal differences. And yeah, I think it's nice to also think about the differences between production and comprehension because they can inform us about the processes and the neural systems that are engaged in language. And yeah, how language processing is really done by the brain. If you don't focus just on comprehension, we can also learn a lot more. And finally, I would also like to say that I focused a lot on frontotemporal regions, but I think there's also a lot more going on. So in one analysis, for example, we looked at the connectivity with the cerebellum, and there was also a lot going on there. The cerebellum was super connected with the rest of the brain as a function of consequence size, and not necessarily just in production, also in comprehension. And so it's possible that we're really missing a lot by just always focusing on this left lateralized frontotemporal network. Okay, so thank you for listening. I would like to thank Jen's General Lab for making the Word timestamps available and this data set, and then my PhD supervisors and collaborators, and the Neurobiology of Language Lab at the UPI for the discussions over the years.
Thank you very much. Let's do questions from the room first. If you can, please speak up so that our mic room can pick you up. Yeah.
Thank you for the nice talk. I think this is really impressive stuff, especially with the spontaneous production. I know how complicated. I would never do such an experiment myself, so I'm glad that you did it instead.
Well, I also didn't do it right.
Well, you still had to analyze the data, do the parsing and all of that, right? So I guess my question is, what do you? I couldn't quite tell if you had like a clear idea about differentiation of function between the frontal and temporal areas. You talked about differences in temporal dynamics there, which I think are interesting and probably a bit surprising. If I had to think about it, I think it would be surprising to me, right? That you do the spontaneous production, you see this clear difference between earlier activation frontal versus later activation temporal. So if I were trying to say, if I was trying to advocate a claim that like posterior temporal lobe was critically involved in building the syntactic structure, I feel like I couldn't really, that data would contradict that hypothesis, because it seems like you get those activations in frontal lobe, which should imply that it's doing something about planning the structure. And if so, that means that the subjects have like been able to plan a structure at that time point before the temporal lobe was active. So what does that, What do you make of that?
Yeah, I think it's really hard to say. I think this relates to the one of the last things I said, that I think we just don't know enough with fMRI. I think we're missing out on a lot of temporal information. And I don't. So if we were to really take these temporal dynamics at face value, then it would be BA45 does syntactic structure in production, and posterior temporal lobe does it in comprehension. Which again, I don't think is very parsimonious. I don't think it's a nice way of thinking about it. It could still be the case. Obviously, of course, this is all correlational, and I mean, there's plenty of studies that also show different things. But eventually, what I think is happening, and it's just kind of speculation, is that we need both regions, and the studies with more temporal resolution actually show this, that there's a lot more connectivity between these regions that happens a lot faster than what we can measure with fMRI. And probably this is just an effect of this design, where what we're measuring here, like these metrics, then just show us this later response in the posterior temporal lobe. But if we had like a different type of measure that is still related to syntactic structure building, that would show a different effect in the posterior temporal lobe. And also another thing that could be going on here is that we really focus on the posterior MTG, but it could be that if we had taken the STS or even the STG, maybe we would have seen a different latency. So this, I think, is also one of the maybe problems or limitations of this study, that it's just focused on that very specific area. That includes part of the STS, but not part.
Can you do a functional localization with the data set that you have?
Maybe, yeah, with word rate, we could do it, but there's two problems here. One is that there's only 16 participants per production, so that's really not a lot. It would be nice to have more. And the other thing is that these are kind of not very sensitive measures. So word rate is going to elicit a very strong response throughout the network, but these syntactic parsers, I don't think, are strong enough. I think at some point I also tried to do whole brain analysis, and then using SPM, which is very strict rules for how you do it, and it really seemed like the results were not consistent enough. So I think an RI analysis here is just a lot better for testing your hypothesis than.
You mentioned to account for the reduced constituency effect in comprehension as opposed to compared to production, that in comprehension we can be a little more lazy, as you said, right? So like do good enough processing, or you don't have to do a full parse to get basic good understanding. That probably is also related to your purpose of comprehending, right? So in other words, do you think you could come up with a comprehension task that would do away with that laziness effect? So basically forcing your participants to do a full parse and not being able to rely on good enough parsing.
Yeah, so I think this has been done a lot with the more complex tasks like object extracted sentences or passing and so on, where maybe you really force participants to do it. But I think that also has some confounds, and then that becomes more of a task. So again, it's not very naturalistic. Maybe if it was a conversation, which is not very easy to study, but maybe in conversation where you really have to maybe understand what someone is saying to be able to respond. So instead of having a task where you measure how much someone has understood, but you force them to have to say something related to what I said before, then that would be a way of forcing the syntactic processing in a more naturalistic way. But yeah, it's probably quite hard.
That's the classic challenge in this work, right? To separate general cognitive effort, things that are hard, right, from something that is purely syntactic.
Yeah. Then
the question becomes, maybe that's not inherently possible.
Yeah, right? Maybe that's the whole point, that syntax also relies is kind of holding different things in working memory as a way of putting them together, and that's cognitive effort.
On the method side, you mentioned fMRI is not really giving us everything we would want, right? Temporally, for example. What method do you think would be ideal for testing this, temporal dynamic hypothesis? The idea that we're basically looking at the same network, but the temporal dynamics differ between production and comprehension. What could you use?
Well, I think just intracranial EEG right now would be the only way. I think MEG and EEG are still too sensitive to motion artifacts, and also to just articulation elicits these really big responses that maybe cover everything else. At least that's what I know from people that use MEG and EEG for production studies. So I think at this stage, intracranial EEG is a good way of doing it. And I know there's some groups that are doing this so far, but I haven't heard of anyone doing a comparison between production and comprehension yet.
Of course, you'd be confined to cortex,
Yeah.
right? You're missing out on basal ganglia, which we haven't even talked about.
Yeah, exactly.
And, yeah. We have a question online from Greg Hickok. Would you agree that lesion data could help constrain these models? For example, we see fairly strong dissociations between comprehension and production following damage to the frontal and temporal areas. Frontal damage affects mostly production, temporal damage affects both comprehension and production.
Yes, I think so. I think that's also why I'm here, so that I can learn a bit more from all the lesion data. I think so. One of the things that I've always been wondering about with the lesion studies is to what extent compensation theories play a role. So to what extent we can be sure that the lesions that we see are really affecting dysfunction and we're not compensated by something else. So this is something that I sometimes think about. I think you guys have a lot to say about it. And I do think all of that I've talked about needs to be integrated with it. But eventually, of course, the frontal lobe is going to have a stronger effect on production because without it, you just cannot produce. And in a similar way, temporal lobe for comprehension just is a function of hearing. But I think then the fact that both are important, also having the lesions is probably going to affect production and comprehension in a different way in terms of what is really necessary and what isn't, and how, yeah, what I show here is more how these regions act maybe together when they're both available, but it doesn't mean that they cannot, only one part of the cortex can do something when the other part is lesion. I think it's not super easy to put everything together given the differences between the methods.
Yeah, I can imagine. So your hypothesis, though, that we're really talking about one network that is used for both, does imply that you should, at least to some extent, right? The hypothesis would be that to some extent with frontal damage, you do expect some comprehension problems, right? Because that would otherwise not fit with that model, right? So with temporal damage, we know that yields both comprehension and production problems for sentence processing, right? So that fits, I guess.
Yeah.
But the frontal part, I wonder about in relation to Greg's question.
Yeah, I think that's what I was trying to get at. That maybe that's what you normally use in comprehension when you have the frontal lobe, you use it and it's important. But when it's not available anymore, maybe actually things can still work out in some way. I think it depends a bit on what the frontal lobe is doing in this case and how it helps maybe maintaining information. I guess it's still a bit of a question. And I see William has...
Yeah, just to follow up, I mean, there is something I think interesting question to look at acute. I think this needs to be investigated a little more in acute stroke. I know there's been some work on this, but I remember there's a case study from R.G. Hillis's group where they had a patient with a very selective blockage, blood flow, hypoperfusion, pretty selective to Broca's area, and then the subject looked very bad in terms of comprehending these syntactic complex sentences. It showed the traditional agrammatic profile, and then they reperfused the area, the subject looked normal, and then they showed the area of hypoperfusion. It was like right in 844, 45. So I think it'd be interesting to follow up on that and try to understand what's happening there, because I think there's something going on there that's interesting. But
that will be completely in line with that.
Yeah.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I'm trying to give you a little bit
a
place to kind of explore that. And but like I think that, but I'm still very interested in the fMRI data. Like I agree with you, I think we're missing a lot, right? There's a lot of things that we're just totally not seeing with the fMRI response that we probably would see if we had a different method. But it's still interesting that you do see this pretty clear dissociation in your data. like it implies the functional dissociation that you see seems to suggest that both areas are relevant to the general question, but that they are doing something different. They are contributing something different, right? I think that both Greg's question speaks to that, and your own data speak to that, right? That they're like, Rogue's area is more active at the beginning in some form, right? Maybe it's not, it's also active later for some other dimension, but when you're able, whatever you're able to see with bold is different between those areas, which implies there's something different, right? So I guess my question is, you know, obviously I spent a lot of time trying to speculate about that, but do you have any speculation as to functional dissociation?
Yeah, so first I want to say something about this that I'm still not super sure about, but it could also be that the parser, so this top-down parser, is modeling structure building in different ways in production and comprehension. So it could be that it's kind of oversimplifying what is going on, and in comprehension it picks up on some things, in production different things, because actually production and comprehension are different. You are mapping information to some extent.
Even within production, though, if you ignore comprehension, if you just looked at your production data, you see temporal difference between the two areas.
Yeah, and yeah, in this case, I think that's a bit what I was trying to say, that really seems the A45 is doing more of the initial mapping, initial structure building from a semantic structure, so mapping from the semantic structure to the syntax, and then it seems the posterior temporal lobe is doing more of the lexical encoding. But again, I feel like it's still quite speculative given that the parser is a coarse measure and the temporal dynamics are also quite coarse. Yeah, but I agree. It does suggest that there's some dissociation what the regions are doing.
Questions from the room? Thank you very much, Laura. Thanks to our online audience, and we hope to see you again in the new year, 2024, January 18th. Happy New Year.